Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Rihanna Putnam. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for the Citizen Science Association. We're excited today to be hosting a volunteer fieldwork during COVID-19 town hall with Chris Stepanuck and Janelle Dowling. I have just a few slides about the CSA and some housekeeping notes, and then I'll turn it over to Chris and Janelle to get us started. The CSA is a member-driven organization that connects people from a wide range of experiences around a shared purpose of advancing knowledge through research and monitoring done by, for, and with members of the public. Our efforts are concentrated into a biennial conference. Our next one is in May of 2021. We have a peer-reviewed journal and member services such as our working groups, online networking, and webinars like these. Our membership represents the multidisciplinary and multidimensional nature of the field and includes project leaders, researchers, educators, and more. We have 9 working groups that explore cross-cutting issues like evaluation, ethics, data, and more. Our working groups are one of the key ways that we work to advance the goals of CSA through the sharing of resources, best practices, and relevant information, both among group members and also to the broader citizen science community. Our webinars are often led by these working groups, but occasionally, such as today, we invite other community experts to lead timely discussions. With all of our webinars, views shared here are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent those of CSA. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to a YouTube channel. You can find an archive of all of our past webinars on our website. You can also find registration links to upcoming events such as these 2 happy hours on using citizen science in higher education, one this Friday, and then we also have one on the 12th. I realize that the date on the slide is wrong. So you can find out more information about those on our website under the webinars tab. There are a few ways that you can help support these free webinars from CSA. One is by becoming a member. Membership dues are an important contribution to the work that we do to create connections across the field and support our working groups and the quality webinars that they and others help coordinate. If you're not already a member, you can find out more information on our website. We also have a donation page that I can link to in the chat. If you find value in learning from this online opportunity and have the means, you can help cover hard costs to keep webinars free for those who can't pay. And like I mentioned, we are expecting a large crowd today and encourage you to double check that your audio and video are both turned off. You can introduce yourself in the chat now and post any questions that you have there. We'll have opportunities later, hopefully for some verbal question and responses towards the end, and you'll find out a little bit more about where else you can chime in. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chris Stepanuck, Extension Assistant Professor at the University of Vermont, and Janelle Dowling, the Scientific Director at Adventure Scientist, to lead today's event. Thanks to Chris and Janelle for putting this together.
Thanks, Rihanna. So welcome everybody. We're glad that you're with us. I am Chris Stepanuck. Again, as Rihanna said, I work at the University of Vermont with the Lake Champlain Sea Grant Program and worked with citizen science and volunteer water monitoring since about 2001. I will let Janelle introduce herself.
Great. I'm Janelle Dowling. I'm the Scientific Director of Adventure Scientists. And we do some water monitoring activities as well, but we work across disciplines and different scientific projects. We manage about 3,000 volunteers about a year right now, and our programs are constantly growing. So we're excited to talk to you about this today. So I'm gonna get the PowerPoint.
So we encourage everybody, again, to introduce yourselves in the chat. And we also have a few poll questions that we will run to give you a sense of who's here. So you're seeing the first of 2 polls right now. What type of organization do you represent, with options for federal, state, local government, nonprofit or NGO, academia, K-12 education, business, industry, or something else? And the second question is, where are you based? Are you in the United States in the Midwest, Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, Southwest, Alaska, Hawaii, or the territories? Or are you somewhere outside of the US? And if you are, let us know where you are in the chat so we can know exactly where outside of the US you're from. And also welcome to do that if you're from within the US or the territories as well. Looks like we've got about 70% of people have voted. We'll give you just another minute. About 80%. All right, the poll has closed. So you can see, I think Rihanna is going to share the results with everybody. The majority of folks are representing nonprofits, NGOs, about 56% of us. About 20% are from the federal, state, or local government, and equally just over 20% academia, and just a few folks representing other types of organizations. Our primary audience is about 40% from the northeastern United States, about 20% from the Southwest, 16% from the Midwest, 12% from the Southeast, and 11% from the Northwest. So welcome everybody. Glad you're with us. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat. It's good to see some familiar names and some new names to me. Glad that you're all with us. So Janelle will share our start to our slideshow. Thank you. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so we just to give you the lay of the land for today, we're modeling this webinar similarly to one we ran in April that I ran with Jill Carr from Massachusetts Bay National Estuary Partnership. So we started with our introductions and our polls. We're going to lay out kind of what the issue is and why we're here and what we're trying to do today, the goals. Looking back at some of the tips and tricks that we have heard, we learned either at that April webinar with volunteer water monitoring programs, or that have come in after that, where people have said, hey, this is what I'm doing. Can you make sure that gets shared in the resources? We'll learn about the kinds of impacts that have come and resulted to volunteer water monitoring programs to kind of give you a sense of where other people are at. And then Janelle will share case studies from the Adventure Scientists program and what they've been doing in response to COVID, as well as prior to that. And then we'll open it up and have a conversation with all of you. What are your challenges? What are your needs? What are the things that you want to talk about from your perspective that you may be able to get information from others who are on the call and in the meeting in the town hall today? So everybody knows we are recording. This will be posted, as Rihanna said, on the Citizen Science Association website and YouTube afterwards. Everybody is muted, has their cameras off. When we do get into the town hall session, we do welcome you to turn on your microphones and to speak, to use the chat, and to also use a Google Sheet that we will send a link to in the chat that you can directly add your tips and tricks that you have come up with and the things that you're doing or resources that you have available that you're willing to share with others in that Google Sheet. And we'll try to facilitate the conversation between what's happening in the chat. If you want to raise your hand in the participant box or just speak up is okay as well. So we'll move to the next slide. So as you probably know, we are here because of the COVID pandemic and the concerns that we have across volunteer monitoring, citizen science, community science, or whatever name you use for public participation in scientific research, to ensure the safety of the volunteers and the people who are participating, to recognize that there is still challenges in our ability to test and to know and to identify how this illness is spreading person to person. We know it does, and we want to make sure that our volunteers can be safe. There are coordination concerns that range from liability of sending volunteers out into the field, not having guidelines that are defining what is the best practice for putting your volunteers in the field, and trying to make decisions when it's kind of unknown, just like we see the governors of our states moving slowly or taking approaches very carefully, because we just don't understand or don't know what the COVID situation will be at any given time. So it's hard to make a decision, and that reflects back to your decisions as program coordinators and leaders. So our goals today, again, are to share some of the tips and things that other programs have been doing to give you a space to converse with one another over the challenges and questions that you have, and then to share what kinds of impacts and have been felt by volunteer monitoring and other citizen science programs to date. Next slide, please. So we'll have a sharing of ideas and the decisions and impacts. Next slide. One of the things that you'll see when we get to the sharing of results is we separated our ask. And so this is for you all to think of too, is can we categorize the tips and the questions and the recommendations into what should the project coordinators and the project kind of be thinking about overall? What should the volunteers be thinking about before they head into the field? What should they be doing when they're in the field? And what should we be doing in the lab or in the classroom for training and when people are indoors together? So we've categorized this Google spreadsheet in that manner. And again, welcome you to add your ideas to that Google spreadsheet. And we'll post that link in the chat. Next slide, please. So what we've done from the April 21st webinar, that was about 200 volunteer water monitoring program coordinators and others from a wide range of geographies. We categorized those tips from the program level, the in the field, the before you leave, and the lab and the classroom into about 12 categories. And what I had done is do a survey after that to ask the programs who had participated, what have you done as a result of hearing those tips and sharing those resources with one another? So these are in order of the most things that have been implemented. And I have 3 slides that I'll show you, and I'll talk through the categories of the kinds of tips and what people have done. So the most implemented thing that has happened is that people have included COVID-related modifications in their program guidance, sharing with their volunteers what they should be doing to keep themselves safe, both with personal protective equipment, with disinfecting of equipment, and other modifications that they might be making to how samples are shared or collected or equipment is moved and people are moving about. So that's 70% of programs have already implemented that, 30% are likely to implement that, and a very small percent is not planning to implement that at all. The second most common category was where programs have postponed the start of their field sampling. So just about half of the 66 programs that have answered the survey to date, when I analyzed this yesterday, had said that they'd postponed the sampling season. It looks like not that many more are thinking about doing that. It's about 5% who are thinking that might still do that. And then the remainder are not going to be doing that. The next category, again, about half of the responding programs had changed the field team or the timing or the logistics of how the folks were going about. So that could mean they were having volunteers go and sample alone, or they were having them think about working in household teams if they wanted them to be together. They were having volunteers go out in staggered times rather than everybody going as a team of different households at one time. They might have them go out every hour across 3 or 4 hours. They were also giving volunteers specific equipment assignments so they could divvy up the responsibilities and they didn't have to share equipment, where somebody's totally responsible for the biological monitoring and somebody's totally responsible for the chemical or the physical, and divvying up the equipment that way. So about half of programs have done that, and over 40% are probably planning to do that at some point as they get going with their field season. Just over about 45% of the programs have developed some kind of a plan if a volunteer becomes ill and needs to relinquish or step away from the monitoring, or if they have health challenges and they need to protect themselves, and so they are quarantining or isolating themselves from others, they've developed a plan, or they're planning to. About 35% of programs are planning to do that. And then the modification of communications with the volunteers. Thinking about if programs are facilitating online meetups, they're having social media sharing among volunteers, so there can still be camaraderie among the people who are participating. They're offering online question and answer sessions as examples of how they're modifying communications. Next slide, please. Over 35% of programs have already implemented changes in how they have the lab set up. Some of them are having one-way directional walkways, like you might have seen in some grocery stores. They're putting protection between different lab stations. They are having people drop off their samples in different ways, that maybe they're having an outside station where people can drop off, where it's safer, where there's UV light available, and they're having people schedule their drop-offs, and so they can do contact tracing if needed, as well as spacing people out in time. They've also, some programs have expanded the window of opportunity for collecting a sample, where it used to be maybe it was over 2 days, maybe now it's over a week. So they have fewer people coming to the lab at any given time. So about 35% of programs have already done that, and about another third are intending to do that. The next one is conducting online training, and already we've seen over a third of the programs have done this, and another almost looks like 45% are intending to conduct online trainings. Providing personal protective equipment or cleaning and disinfecting supplies to the volunteers. Already 35% of programs have done that, and another third are intending to do that. And then the last one on this slide is about a third of programs have already modified their field sampling methods. In this case, it could be that they've dropped certain parameters to monitor, or changed and tried to do them in a way that is remote or friendly. So I know an example from here, rather than having volunteers collect the usual data, they're having volunteers collect visual data for a site, and treating it more as an observational monitoring rather than as a collecting data to say water quality is this kind of monitoring. So again, about a third of programs have already done that, and about 25 to 30% are planning to do that. Next slide, please. Probably the thing that I was most curious about in terms of how is this impacting volunteer programs is wondering about if programs have fully canceled their field seasons. What we know is only about 15% of programs have already done this, and less than 10% more are thinking about completely canceling their field season. It's telling to me that more than 50% wouldn't even be considering this. And that's reflected in people's comments in the survey, where they say that one of the the benefits that have come is people are feeling more close to one another. People really want to get out in the field as a place to be, to feel normal, and to feel like what they're doing is valued, and to be having the opportunity to be out in the place that they care about to monitor. So telling there that the canceled field seasons are not happening except for a small percent of programs. The less than 30% of programs have already modified how sample gets to the lab. I was explaining that a little bit earlier. And one other thing that had come up as a tip in the previous webinar was to only utilize the services of volunteers who had been previously trained. And that's due to the challenge of training people to do field methodologies via video training. And so in the end, it looks like about 25% of programs have decided to use their suite and cadre of volunteers who were previously trained in past years. As a result, that means that they'll have less new volunteers this year, and potentially less participation in future years, depending on their retention rates. And it's looking like over 40% of programs are considering doing that and utilizing the services of people who've been previously trained. I did see some comments about people who are trying to have folks mentor to help some new people get on board, but in general, it looks like that seems to be a popular choice. and then modifying data entry procedures. It's about 1 in 5 programs has decided to change how the data are being entered. Next slide, please. So I asked about what are the negative impacts that have resulted. And so just to share with you the overall summary, there's a loss in the number of data observations that are being made because people are delaying their field seasons and therefore less able to collect information about what's happening in the environment. Like I was saying, with the people relying upon the previously trained volunteers, there's a loss in numbers of volunteers as well as people who are isolating and not able to participate this year. So about 30% of programs have lost volunteers. There are signs of economic loss to the programs. I didn't put the slide up, but what I am seeing in the results is it looks like most programs that are reporting an economic losses, about 15–16% of programs, they're saying it's about a quarter of their annual budgets that they have lost as a result of not being able to monitor as planned. And then there's also been, for about 12% of programs, a loss of staff or staff time. And some programs reported other types of losses. Next slide, please. So I wanted to point out, and this will come in a little bit later, but we also collected resources that we will ask you to share as well, and you can utilize the ones that are there in this Google spreadsheet. But the summary of what's in that spreadsheet right now includes folks' training videos. If you're in need of those, I saw that many groups that went online with training had to create training videos, and that's one of the needs. And hopefully something that we can come up with for a future webinar is helping people understand how to do an effective online training and giving you tips and tricks for that, because a lot of people didn't already have training videos. So those are out there from some groups that had them. Giving tips on how to disinfect field equipment, how to clean or disinfect microscopes. There were examples shared of liability waivers, how to safely use disinfectants. And then a number of groups I have posted, kind of the bottom of the resource list when we get to the Google Sheet, is resources of what other programs have said to their volunteers. And several people have shared those with me that I've posted in that page, and some people have shared their own. Next slide. Turning it back to Janelle for the case studies from Adventure Scientists.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Chris, am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, great. So Adventure Scientists is a conservation nonprofit. We're based in Bozeman, Montana. And what we do is we mobilize folks from the outdoor adventure community to collect data for our scientific partners. And the research that we do focuses on environmental issues, conservation, and human health. So here's a list of our general best practices for volunteer management. These are things that we've typically been doing since the organization started to do good volunteer management. We have clear and appropriate research goals. We have a specialized team and a lot of support on our staff for the organization. We recruit volunteers that are based on the data that are needed, and we train them very carefully. We offer continuous support and communication, and then we evaluate our progress continually and systematically. So like many of you, we have a new best practice that has come to the forefront. And this is just basic safety of our volunteers and the communities in which they're working. So like I said, for our volunteers at Adventure Scientists, we carefully train them, but we've always done this online because we have such a large number of volunteers that's working both nationwide and in some cases worldwide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share our trainings with you. I'm going to go through just a screen share to show you how we do our trainings for Adventure Scientists. I'll give an example from our Wild and Scenic Rivers project, and I'll also share the online training module for COVID safety. Okay. So I'm going to start with our data collection training module, and we use a program called Articulate. So we create these, it's sort of an authoring program where we create these sort of visually really appealing and also easy to flow through trainings for our volunteers. So I'll just go ahead and move through this training. So this is a training on how to collect data using a multi-probe system called a field kit. And this is for water quality data collection. So we have some basics with some graphics with a lot of detailed information. And we include a lot of photos, really simple text, some GIFs. And in some cases, we also have videos that are linked via YouTube that show more detailed protocols for what to do in the field. And what we like about the way that we set these up is that they're segmented so that you don't get too much information all at once. And to move from one section to another, in a lot of cases, volunteers will need to interact or click on certain things so that we know that they're engaged. There's no interactive components in this particular training, but we often also will include questions or ways that folks can give feedback or interact in that way by actually writing in. So they move through all of these sections, piece by piece, very little text. And again, a few videos to explain the more complex things, and then they're done with this section. Okay, so next I'm going to show you our COVID-19 safety procedures. And I'll go ahead and read through these. I think a lot of what we have listed here with regard to safety precautions already mentioned within Chris's surveys, but just in case there's something here that's additionally helpful to folks, I'm going to go ahead and read them. So for this training, they just work through these different sections. So the biggest thing that we have found, and I feel like this is one of the most important things, is to remind and just constantly remind folks to follow all local advisories and guidelines and remind them to check for updates regularly. We ask them to not leave home to collect data if anyone in their household is feeling sick. We ask them to choose data collection sites that are close to their home and limit travel. We specifically ask within our newsletters and other communications that folks do not travel across state lines. And before leaving home, we ask that they make plans to limit the number of stops they make, practice social distancing while making any stops, and take separate cars if they're collecting data with people that are from outside of their household. We do not at Adventure Scientists provide PPE because we don't generally provide anything beyond scientific sampling equipment to our volunteers. They tend to provide their own gear, their own backpacks and things like that. So we include PPE in that, but we ask that they provide their own. We ask that they prep equipment early before they get out into the field so they don't need to spend a lot of time in high trafficked areas like trailheads. And we ask that they ensure that the data collection site sections, parking lots, trailheads, put-ins, et cetera, are not closed before they go to sample. Because I know there's a lot of variation whether or not parks and other public spaces have closed down trails or just the facilities that they offer. And like I said, we ask them not to travel across state lines to collect data. Okay, so in the field, we ask that if somebody is collecting data with somebody who's outside of their household, they practice social distancing with that person, maintaining 6 feet distance. They wear PPE while collecting data. They maintain more than 6 feet of distance if they're doing heavy breathing activities like biking, rafting, or things like that, which many of our volunteers are doing while they're collecting data. Minimize equipment sharing and sanitizing before things are passed from one individual to another, and not sharing writing equipment. We ask that they maintain 6 feet of distance from anyone else they encounter on the trails, that they wash or sanitize their hands regularly, and avoid dining in public places when they're going out to collect data. So one thing that we really want to focus on for our volunteers is not only to keep them safe, but also to make sure they're keeping the communities that they move through or go to collect data safe. And we also include a section for our volunteers about what we're doing to make sure they stay safe and how we're keeping our own staff safe. So we mentioned that we sanitize all of the equipment that we send out to volunteers before it leaves our headquarters, as well as sanitizing it again when it returns. We monitor the COVID-19 cases very closely among our leadership team to make sure that we're making decisions that are very careful, very data-driven, and totally safety-based as a first priority. And we also have limited, like Chris mentioned, with a lot of lab precautions, we've limited any person-to-person contact involved with giving people their equipment. Okay. And that's about it for our training. So I'm going to go back to our presentation and turn it back over to Chris.
So just to point out, there's a couple questions I think would be valuable if you wanted to answer right now. One is, what was the software Articulate? Is that correct? That you're using to make your trainings?
Yeah, Articulate. It's a program that does have an annual subscription fee. I think it's like $800-900 a year, but it's a really great system. We've tried a couple others. We use that in conjunction with a learning management system called Wisetail. So we manage our volunteers via Wisetail, but we author our trainings within Articulate. And we've tried out a bunch of different ones, and Articulate has been the one that we've liked the look of the best and has the best flow with regard to the learning style of approaching a lot of different learning styles for volunteers.
Yeah, it's definitely eye-catching. It looks very nice. And there's several comments in the chat to say that. So thanks for sharing that. Super valuable to have the detailed information about what you're sharing and what you're doing and what you're providing or not providing to folks. And it's one thing that stood out to me was the sharing with the volunteers what you are doing to clean supplies before they get them from you. So it's super helpful. So now is our town hall. So we're opening it up to all of you, and in several manners. You may write in the chat if you have questions like we've already started to address. You are more than welcome to turn on your microphone and ask a question. There is in the participants box, there is a place where you can actually raise a hand. So we can try to keep an eye out for folks who are raising their hands. The Google Sheet, let's see, I'm just about to share that in the chat. You may add to it if you have tips that you'd like to share with folks for what you are doing, or you can use it as a resource to see what tips others have already shared. There are 2 tabs in the Google Sheet. One is the tips for before you leave, for programs, while you're in the field, while you're in the lab, and the other is the resources tab. So if you have resources you want to share, if you're only on the phone and you can't see what I put in the chat, if you can access this Google Sheet, if you go to volunteermonitoring.org/COVID, COVID, that is HTTP volunteermonitoring.org/COVID. That particular page of that website has the April 21st webinar. So if you scroll down within the list of what's there, one of the links is to the Google Sheet, and we're just building upon that same Google Sheet from April 21st today. You're also welcome to email me or Janelle if you want. We'll try to keep our eyes on our email, but feel free. We can start looking here in the chat and to see if any hands are raised from folks. Okay, so somebody asked a question about the survey. What was the breakdown of types of organizations that responded? It's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can look it up. Most of the folks who were on that call were either, it was a lot like today, it was either nonprofits and local, state, or federal government were the representatives, and I don't know off the top of my head what the breakdown of the people who have responded to the survey is. There's a question, is the link for the Adventure Scientist COVID-19 training available in the Google Sheet? I know there's a link to reach contacts at Adventure Scientist. Janelle, is there?
Yeah, I can field that. So those ones are, they haven't been made public yet because we're just getting them out to volunteers now. But we don't share them publicly at this point. I can check in to see whether or not we can. It's a little bit complicated to make that happen because of the way that we do our workflows with our volunteers. But you are welcome to volunteer with us, and then you'll get all the trainings. But I'm happy to share screenshots and other examples if folks just need things they want to model after.
There's another question I think that I don't think you've addressed yet. Does Articulate allow you to see who has completed the training or who and or does it provide any type of certificate upon completion?
That's a great question. That's a problem that we wanted to solve. And the way that we solve that is working through our learning management system. So the learning management system will tell us, and again, the one that we use at Adventure Scientists is called WiseTail. That will tell us where people are with regard to progress. It'll allow us to send people certain trainings, but not others. If, you know, some people are only collecting certain types of data and in other places it's not regionally appropriate. But yeah, the learning management systems helps us to kind of limit those workflows. And I think you could probably work in some sort of certificate with that as well. But we've combined those two systems to have them work how we need them to work.
Awesome. There is a question for, I think this may be a collective question from the field, and maybe we can answer it or not. So it's what Kat Lewis is asking, what cleaning agent are people using that's both COVID approved as well as ecosystem friendly?
I can share that we're using Lysol wipes. So, you know, I think, so from what I've read personally, detergents, anything that breaks down lipid bilayers, anything that breaks up viruses. So soap works great for anything. Soap is a little tougher to use on things like field equipment. So we're using Lysol or bleach wipes, anything that has a disinfectant in it. So if anybody has feedback about something that's also environmentally friendly, I'd love to hear, because I'm not sure that Lysol is.
Yeah. There's, in the resources link, there is a link to EPA approved disinfectants, and it has everything from the Lysol and the simple baby wipes or whatnot that are, believe it's 70% alcohol is the minimum. So in there you can look through. I don't know if there are specific ones that are friendly. If anybody does want to speak up, we do welcome you to share if you know something that we don't. There's a message. Okay, next question from Craig Hensley. Do you ask volunteers to follow local guidelines before they do their volunteering? So I think you might mean the health guidelines.
Craig says yes.
Craig says yes. Okay, so yes, Janelle, do you want to field that one from your program?
I want to make sure I understand the question first. Do you ask volunteers to follow local guidelines before they volunteer? Well, I'm not sure I totally understand. What I want to make sure is that you mean before you accept them to volunteer. Is that what you mean? Or do you ask them to practice social distancing and things like that before they volunteer?
I think that.
If a community has specific restrictions in place, do you expect your volunteer to follow these first and foremost? Yes, the answer to that question is absolutely yes.
I agree.
And I think that's a little bit easier with regard to volunteer management for many of the coordinators that are on the line. I think that, we considered that as an organization going case by case and going state by state or county by county and saying, we'd prefer that you not volunteer if you were coming from this place or this place. And that's a little bit impossible to go through and just maintain all of that information because it's changing so quickly. So we, both in our communications and in our liability waiver, we put the onus on the volunteer and really give them the resources that they need to check up on local regulations, but really push that the local regulations are changing quickly. The local health organizations will know best about what's happening in your county and state. So we really push that they should be following those. And first and foremost, before any recommendations that we make.
All right, I'm looking for what's the next. Let's see. So Luke mentioned that they've used a compound called Virkon for sanitizing waders and equipment in the past. It's approved by Maryland Department of Natural Resources. It's a powder that you mix into the water and then spray onto gear. I will add that one has a lot of training required and there are some health concerns associated with it, you should be wearing specific personal protective equipment when using Virkon. We had it in Wisconsin for New Zealand mud snails, and so just be aware that that one is, it does its job, but the folks who are using it need to be careful about their own protection when using Virkon. The question from Craig Hood, wondering about if anybody's addressed contact tracing. And again, we do welcome you to unmute yourselves and to participate in the conversation. We would welcome folks to be helping us to answer questions from across all of you. I think the best example I have of that from what I've heard programs are doing has to do with the lab, making appointments to go to the lab. And so people can at least trace, if they knew if somebody had become ill, they could trace back and help with the health department if they were doing contact tracing, to be able to say, these are the people who came within this time period of the day, so they can be able to help them do the contact tracing. I think there are privacy laws that unless a volunteer tells you that they have become ill, that it wouldn't be you as a coordinator who would be doing the contact tracing yourself, but it would be going back to some of these new positions that have been developed in the States to do the contact tracing when somebody does become identified as having COVID. And Luke commented, I should say, Virkon's easier on gear than bleach. I totally agree. That's one reason that it's good. The question from Katie Remini, has anyone differentiated protocols or recommendation based on whether volunteers self-identify into CDC high-risk categories? For instance, should volunteers who are in high-risk categories still participate? I have not heard of people making that determination for the volunteers, but there is examples of giving the volunteers that option themselves. So that's where some volunteers may choose not to participate, but the programs that I have heard from haven't specifically told people that they cannot, and it's been left up to them. Your experience, Janelle?
Yeah, so like you, we leave that up to the volunteers, and at least in Montana, that's included in our state guidelines. Our phased reopening includes guidelines for folks who are in high-risk categories. And what, at least in Montana, we are currently in phase 2 of reopening, which is pretty open at this point. And we are still recommending as a state that folks who are at high risk do not leave their homes. So that's one of those situations where we defer to the state health agency, the county health agency, who knows best about that.
Yeah, this is Katie. We're in Washington State, so it's somewhat similar, but yeah, we are making that recommendation, but of course we can't go around and, ask or check whether people fall into a high risk category. So it's, in a sense, it is up to them to choose, but we're making that recommendation that folks who feel that they fall into a high risk category, that they don't participate at this time, also according to our state's phased reopening.
That's a great suggestion to make it explicit.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. Tim Craddock from the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection shared that he has some general guidance for fieldwork he's willing to share if people are interested. I would say yes. I think that would be really great if you're willing to share it. One place you could do that is in the second tab of the Google Sheet. If you have if there's a place where it's posted online to share a link, or if you don't have access to that, Tim, I'm happy to, if you send it to me, I can create it give it a home online, that I can create a link for it to put in there. Or if folks want to contact Tim directly, Tim, can you share your email maybe in the chat so folks can contact you directly to get information? Let's see, Brendan says, possibly a moot point, probably comes up with signing waivers, but has anyone had pushback for following guidelines for wearing a mask or something else. This has come up with a longtime volunteers in Brendan's project. I don't have experience with that, so I have to throw it to the crowd or throw it over to Janelle.
Yeah, that's a situation where we've had similar, not quite exact, but similar situations where folks have said, like, I want to come to Montana to volunteer for this project. Can I drive to your state so that I can participate in this project? And we've had to point back to our regulations and guidelines and say, no, that our guidelines are that we prefer that folks do not cross state lines to collect data. And we just kind of stick to that and, stick to it confidently. So I think that in that case, if it's in your guidelines that you require people to wear masks or sign a waiver that that outlines a number of precautions, then I think that you can point back to that and stick to the regulations that you've decided on.
I had a question that came in via email from Sam Chan with Oregon Sea Grant earlier today, which is actually in line with this. What he asked is, he said field leaders have raised concerns about that wearing masks could be challenging during strenuous tasks outdoors. People asked about face shields. He asked if we could ask you all if people are using face shields as opposed to masks in your programs. I have not heard any examples that have come to me by email, but I don't know if anybody who's on the call or the meeting has seen that, heard that. Sounds like maybe not yet. Let's see, Kate has a question. Are folks doing screenings for symptoms, travel outside the country or etc. prior to every day in the field for interns and volunteers? If so, how formal have these screenings been? A simple no to all symptoms or a document that folks have to fill out electronically, checking yes, no boxes, etc. Do you have folks do that?
You asking me?
Yeah.
We ask people to self-screen. We are generally hands-off with our volunteers. We support them, but we don't do hands-on management with them. They're making their own decisions. But that is a great question. I think with folks that are more involved with their volunteers and are maybe seeing them in the office before they go to the field, that's a great question. Just an example from my office just reopened recently, and we have some folks coming back in at a limited capacity. Before anybody enters the office at the beginning of the workday, we take our temperature.
Yep, and that is true. My husband's office is the same way, where everybody is checked before entering the office. Are there other questions or questions anybody would like to share out loud? If you want to unmute yourselves. I haven't looked into the Google document to see if anybody's added anything into either of the tabs. Let's see if we look under best practices, ideas, looking down at the end. I think we're similar to what was there before. Somebody said, and this may be new, I'll read it because it's possibly new. Somebody says, because of worries about crowding in our parks and trails, we've asked our volunteers to visit sites at off-peak times. And if the parking lot looks crowded, to choose a different location. Can we show or look at the slides again? There were a couple of slide or questions that I forgot about that came out of the survey that we could maybe try to address here as well.
Sure, which
it's slide 20.
Okay, let me know when I get there.
Okay, I'll just read the first one to kind of get us started. So one of the challenges that people put in the comments in the survey that I ran post the April 21st is having concerns about losing a whole season of data. And so that seems like it's about for 15% of programs that have canceled their field seasons. Does anybody have reflections upon that in terms of your programs, thinking about long-term data collection and having a challenge with having lost or potentially losing a season of data as a kind of a gap or hole in time? I think to kind of respond to it from the drone level view is if your program is long term and it's not reliant upon, say, measuring trees that have been planted last year and you need to know their growth every month. If it's something that you can be looking at long-term trends, I think it's probably a lesser concern than if it's something where you need to be seeing what's happening with soil properties that you had expected to change over a shorter period of time, or any kind of parameter that is something that you expected to change this year for some specific reason, that you would then be losing out on those data. What we've seen in Vermont, at least, is that field monitoring has been approved. When we had our first call, it was not approved yet. And at this point, the governor has allowed field crews to go out in small teams, 1 or 2, to collect field data. Through the University of Vermont, we're having to get individualized approval for every research project to go collect data. But for those ones that have that kind of requirement, that need to see data this year for some certain reason, those ones have tended to be approved without question, particularly if it's able to be, the fieldwork is able to be done where it's 1 or 2 people. Another question that came through the survey is, what kinds of suggestions do you all have? And maybe this is a place where you can share in the chat, or again, if anybody wants to speak up, what kinds of suggestions do we have for how to keep volunteers engaged when you are having a different sort of field season? Are you doing anything different with the Adventure Scientists teams to keep them thinking about the programs that they're involved with, or
That's a great question, Chris. I was hoping to get a little video together of something that we did. We recently held a web event called a Pakakacha. It's a Japanese word for chit chat. And what it is folks, we had 3 folks present. It was like 20 seconds per slide, 20 slides or something like that. So we had volunteers present about their experiences volunteering in the field. And then we invited everybody to this webinar who wanted to participate, which was mostly fellow volunteers. So we've had a lot of little events like that. Webinars that keep people engaged that aren't necessarily about like planning for the next field season, and just about either reflecting or having some sort of shared experience around something we're excited about, like field research or conservation and things like that. Yeah, I think little things like that. You could do an Ask Me Anything on Twitter. That's a nice way to engage people quickly with a pretty low effort. And then, yeah, I think that's the kind of general approach is, even if you can't be connecting with them about planning for the field season, connecting about other things that you have in common and have in common with the mission of the organization.
Thank you. So there's 2 more questions I think we can squeeze in here. So one is from Jennifer to Janelle. With the focus of your organization, Adventure Scientists, would you say that you work with a group of particularly independent volunteers accustomed to accepting the responsibilities of personal risk? She says it may be that other audiences may need more guidance and support than your audience.
That's a good question. I'm not sure that it's because we attract particular people. I think it's just we make it really clear from the beginning what our model is. And I think that some people are used to, going into an office, getting an in-person training, but we make it pretty clear when folks are interested in volunteering that it is a process that is very self-guided. These are outdoor adventurers who know how to handle themselves in the outdoors or are excited about learning more about that. So we just make that evident from the very start. And I think that maybe you're right as I'm talking. I think that we do have a tendency to attract people who are already well-versed in a lot of what they're doing. And a lot of that is getting themselves out to work in a backcountry environment, both getting out there and being out there for extended periods of time. So I think we do sort of have that filter a bit already for the folks that come to our organization, but we just outline things really clearly about what the expectation is with regard to how much involvement we'll have.
Nice, thank you. And then one last well, there may be 2 here. Quick question here is, Wendy says, we normally do not encourage volunteers to sample water alone because of safety concerns. However, now the safety concerns of COVID are equally weighted as drowning. So is it possible to sample alone? but it's not the best option, or it is possible to sample alone. Very few of our volunteers are in the same household. Do you have any guidance? So I have a thought, which is, depending on what the water looks like, I'm used to stream and river monitoring, where you could have two people who are at the site together who are safely physically distanced, where somebody could be watching out for the other person, but not necessarily close enough to be a risk because they are outdoors. In a boat, there was some conversation in the last call about how to go about managing that. And that could be more challenging depending on the situation. If it's a canoe and somebody could maneuver that by themselves, and you could have two people in separate canoes, or it may be that you have to forfeit that kind of monitoring. Do you have guidance from the adventure scientist's point of view in terms of that piece?
Yeah, similar to you, if folks are sampling with other folks who are not from their households, we ask them to maintain 6 feet of distance, more if they're doing something that's strenuous and breathing heavily, like biking or kayaking. But yeah, we have that same issue of it is much safer for folks to sample in a team, and we very strongly encourage that. In some projects we require it. But I think that what we would follow up with is that if you are going to monitor with other people and they're not from your household, then you need to maintain that distance. Mm-hmm. And for an example from rafting, our Wild and Scenic Rivers project, a number of our volunteers are raft guides, and many of them have canceled their seasons because of risks. So boating, I think, with a large group is a concern. I agree with Chris there.
Mm-hmm. And then one last comment here from Craig, saying that we've been able to switch gears to webinars for training that many have actually appreciated. Also, while not specific to just volunteers, we've expanded outreach to them and the public to encourage their possible future volunteer engagement through Facebook Live. And that's actually something that was also reflected in the survey that I ran from the April meeting, is that people have said they've had more participation in their trainings and events that they've hosted online than they ever had when they were doing in-person trainings. And so it's actually been, for some programs, a boost in awareness of their program and participation in the virtual way of doing that. Somebody also shares a tip. A couple folks said they shared a tip. They've asked their partner to join them when they were doing fieldwork solo, because that gave them a household connection, and said I made sure to provide him with plenty of coffee. There, says Ryan. Fantastic. And Craig agreed for both of those points. So we do have 2 poll questions to ask all of you to close our session. And thanks for great questions and input through the chat. The first poll question, actually, well, both are showing. One of them is to ask you how useful this meeting was in meeting your needs. And the second is, how interested would you be in having similar meetings to this at a later date? And that's based upon, in part, the needs that have been identified through the survey we ran after the April 21st meeting, and anything that you might want to let us know yourselves about what other kinds of trainings might be useful. One of which I know we're going to try to do has to do with how do you do a more effective online training, because a lot of people have asked for that. So about 60% of folks have voted so far. Okay, we can see that about 54% said very useful, 46% said somewhat useful for the meeting, and then how interested would you be in having similar meetings later on? 78% say interested, 22% somewhat interested. So beautiful. I think that sounds like a go. So thank you, everybody, so much for being with us today. EXA conference, September 6 to 10 is online. And should I turn it over to Rihanna for any final words, or Janelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you both for presenting today and compiling some resources. Sorry, my toddler is observing the 3 p.m. cutoff better than I am. And yeah, I'll be providing a follow-up with a link to this recording probably later this week. And I'll be sure to share the links where you can find the resource document and other resources from that April meeting with the volunteer monitoring group. So great, thank you everyone. And hopefully we'll catch you again on another CSA webinar soon.
Thanks to everyone at CSA, and thanks everybody else for attending.